commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. Hitler's anointed successor. Hermann Göring was a larger-than-life drug addict and poseur. He had been at Hitler's side for over 20 years. He was at the center of every decision that was made. He was the man who had secretly built up the Führer's armed forces, enabling his unprovoked wars against peaceful nations. Göring's Luftwaffe flattened the way into Europe for Hitler's conquering armies. And Göring also first suggested the idea of a final solution: the extermination of the Jews. This made him utterly complicit in the crimes of the Third Reich. At the end of the war, Göring was the only top Nazi left alive. The Allies were desperate to put him in the dock. They needed someone who could embody the evils of the regime. And so at the trial of the century in Nuremberg, he became the star exhibit.
Alle Männer, die irgendwie zur Verfügung waren, waren schon mal dem Volk präsentiert.
His guilt, they said, was unique in its enormity.
They are just pure parasites.
But the ending would be as mysterious as it was controversial and would take everyone by surprise. Germany, 1945. The tide of war had turned against the Nazis. As the Allies pushed deeper into the Third Reich, the outcome was inevitable.
All over occupied Germany, the pattern remains the same. The battle, the swift driving on of the armies, the civilians who come out of their shelters, the posting of Allied proclamations, and a stunned and beaten people, cut off from the outer world, cut off even from its neighbors, is given orders and obeys.
As the Allies closed in, one after the other, the top Nazis chose suicide. Adolf Hitler, the Führer since 1933, killed himself on April the 30th. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's sinister propaganda minister, killed himself and all his family a few hours later. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, he took a cyanide pill after being captured by the British. Now, there was only one left. Hermann Göring, Hitler's deputy and head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He was still at large, and the Allies were desperate to catch him. What the Allied Nazi hunters didn't know was that Hitler's former Reichsmarshall also wanted to make contact with them. Despite being high on the Allies' most wanted list, unbelievably, Göring thought he could secure himself a place in a post-war regime. That sort of bravado was typical of Hermann Göring. He was no pen-pushing bureaucrat. Hermann Göring was an intelligent and imposing man. So unlike many other senior Nazis, Hermann Göring was genuinely formidable. He had been a decorated fighter ace in World War I and had downed 22 enemy airmen. He was the last commander of the legendary Red Baron's fighter squadron. But after the war, when Germany descended into poverty and despair, Göring suffered along with millions of others. The former hero was forced to scrape a living as a circus stunt flyer. But then, an encounter would change his life. He met Adolf Hitler. And soon he was right by Adolf Hitler's side in his fledgling party. In 1923, Hitler appointed Göring head of the SA, the party's storm battalions, uniformed thugs. Göring turned the unruly brown shirts into a disciplined military outfit. Germany was then in a state of political chaos. There was open warfare on the streets. Göring's shock troops fought running battles with the Nazis' arch-enemies, the communists. In November 1923, Göring proved his loyalty to Hitler yet further. The Nazi Party attempted a coup. Göring was seriously wounded and had to be treated with morphine, triggering a drug addiction that would never leave him. The so-called beer hall putsch failed, and Göring had to flee Germany. When he returned in the late 1920s, he found himself once again at Adolf Hitler's side. Together, they planned to build Nazism into a mass political movement. At this stage, the target for Hitler's hatred remained the communists.
Wir wollen nicht lügen und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben.
Their plan succeeded. The party began to win over voters and become a true mass movement.
In uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
In January 1933, Hitler won enough votes to become Chancellor, Prime Minister, in a coalition government. Göring was one of just 2 Nazis in the cabinet.
Preußen wieder zum ersten und stärksten Bollwerk der deutschen Nation zu machen, ist meine Aufgabe.
Three months later, Hitler was given authority to rule by decree. He became dictator. Democracy had died in Germany. These were good times for Hermann Göring. And in 1935, he married Emmy Sonnemann, a former actress, with whom he had a daughter, Edda. Hitler was godfather. Then came yet more success. In 1936, he was given a new and extremely secret mission. After World War I, Germany was forbidden from having anything other than a tiny army. Hidden from the world, Göring supervised the wholesale rearming and re-equipping of the German nation. he created a formidable fighting force with over 500,000 men, equipped with cutting-edge weaponry and technology. His crowning achievement was the creation of a modern air force, the Luftwaffe. To the world's amazement, it was unveiled in 1936. It was the most powerful in Europe, feared and envied in equal measure. But behind the scenes, he now became embroiled in the policies that would make the Nazis so notorious. By the 1930s, the Nazis' focus had shifted towards the Jews, and it became increasingly hostile. First, Jews were singled out for discrimination. Shops were boycotted. Violence at the hands of the SA soon followed. By 1938, there were targeted riots, ransacking of synagogues, murder and imprisonment. Göring, a rabid anti-Semite, actively encouraged this policy towards the Jews. In September 1939, Hitler committed his first major war crime. He invaded Poland. Göring's Luftwaffe was at the forefront of this war of aggression. It played a key part in the Germans' revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics. Its aircraft paved the way for ground forces. Stuka dive bombers were used as aerial artillery to eliminate strongpoints. Medium bombers obliterated larger targets. In Poland, the Low Countries and France, Göring's Luftwaffe pummeled everything in its path. Tanks then pushed fast and deep into enemy territory to capture key objectives, leaving the infantry to mop up behind them. It was a huge success, and Göring was the hero of the hour. In 1941, he was rewarded. In June, he was anointed as Hitler's successor. He was just one heartbeat away from control of the Reich. But then he became involved in the Nazis' most infamous crime. More and more Jews were rounded up in the newly captured lands. In 1941, when Hitler invaded Russia, their numbers grew again, and so did the Nazis' Jewish problem. In a letter dating from just after the invasion of Russia, Göring spoke euphemistically of the need for a final solution. At his insistence, a conference was held at Wannsee, a Berlin suburb, in January 1942. The details of Göring's so-called final solution were worked out. It would be mass murder. Death camps would be created. Poison gas would be used to kill the Jews. This was the first time anyone had ever attempted industrialized killing. From 1941 onwards, 6 million Jews were wiped out. Hermann Göring had started it all off. This made him an arch criminal. Göring had been central to Hitler's wars against peaceful nations and was fully implicated in the Holocaust. But ironically, the first person to hunt him was not the Allies, but Adolf Hitler himself. As the war went on, Göring's fortunes began to wane. In 1943, in Russia, the German Sixth Army was crushed in the cauldron of Stalingrad. Göring had promised the Führer his air force would save the encircled army. But 100,000 German soldiers were killed and 91,000 captured. The Germans were driven from more and more cities in the east.
The end. Like rats from their holes streamed the remains of what was once the flower of Hitler's army. To make doubly sure, one batch clad their flag bearer in white too. In victory, they had pillaged, tortured, murdered. In defeat, they cringed, looking to their vanquishers for what was not to be found in themselves: mercy.
Meanwhile, the German heartland was being blitzed. Allied bombers thundered over the Reich day and night, leveling factories, cities, and docks. Hamburg was flattened. 50,000 were killed. Berlin bombed around the clock. In Dresden, thousands of civilians were killed in just one night. Göring's Luftwaffe now desperately attempted to hold back the Allies. The problem was that the Luftwaffe had been built up for offensive warfare, blitzkrieg. Now Germany was on the defensive, and the overstretched force couldn't cope. Behind his back, other Nazis began mocking Göring. Worse still, his life was spiraling out of control. His drug addiction grew, and by the end of 1944, a huge gulf had opened up between him and the Führer. Hitler was increasingly critical and aggressive towards his Luftwaffe commander. By April 1945, the war was almost over. The Russian juggernaut was in the outskirts of Berlin. Göring knew the Nazis were finished, so he quietly plotted to betray Hitler and save himself. As shells rained down on Berlin, Göring left Hitler's besieged bunker, citing extremely important tasks in the south. He was soon en route to his retreat at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. His plan was to meet General Eisenhower and sue for peace. On the 23rd of April, he had arrived at his Bavarian mountain hideaway. Now he decided to take action. He telegrammed Hitler, asking to assume immediately total leadership of the Reich with complete freedom of action at home and abroad. In Berlin, Hitler was incandescent with rage. His response was swift. Göring was immediately stripped of his right of succession and formally accused of treason. He was to resign immediately. But Hitler's lieutenant, Martin Bormann, went even further. He decided to have Göring arrested and executed for high treason. Göring was now a wanted man. Bormann immediately ordered the SS into action. An elite squad was dispatched to capture and kill the Reichsmarshal. On the evening of the 24th of April 1945, they arrived at Göring's villa. Göring was immediately placed in custody. But despite the death warrant, the SS dithered. Instead of shooting him, they hesitated and kept Göring under house arrest. Meanwhile, all across Germany, chaos reigned. Communications with Berlin had broken down, and the war had only hours to run. As if to remind Göring, the next day he heard RAF bombers flying over Berchtesgaden. Their target, Hitler's nearby mountain retreat, the Berghof. It was reduced to a pile of rubble. And then came a piece of astonishing news from Berlin. The Führer was dead.
Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that, Hitler is dead.
On the night of the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin with a bullet in the head. Göring was off the hook. And within days, many prominent Nazis would also commit suicide, leaving Hermann Göring, the last major Nazi standing. In early May 1945, Hermann Göring moved to Mautendorf, closer to the American lines. He made an arduous journey along roads crammed with refugees and soldiers. His plan was still to do a deal with General Eisenhower. His hope was to prepare himself for the post-war regime and secure himself a future. But what he didn't know was that the Allies had settled on a very different course of action for him, one that had been drawn up 18 months earlier. In fact, the Allied leaders had long had a very clear idea about what to do with the Nazi elite.
For the few days, Tehran becomes the center and focus of the world. We are no longer concerned with the question of how to win the war. The question is, how soon?
At the Tehran summit in November 1943, the big three allies, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, hammered out the details of what punishment might befit the Germans. Stalin, half in jest, suggested the Holocaust could only be avenged by executing 50,000 top Nazis. Roosevelt sarcastically suggested 49,000 would do. Churchill walked out in disgust. Eventually, they reached an agreement. Evil would be put on trial. Now victory was close. an international court was being made ready. There was no legal precedent. Nothing like it had been attempted before. But the Allies needed someone to put on trial. This made Hermann Göring an even more important target, as he was the only one left. As Göring plotted his next move, the final chapter in the Third Reich was being written. Germany formally surrendered on the 7th of May, 1945. The war was over. Radios across the theater of operations told troops from both sides to stand down. Hermann Göring could now make his move. Oblivious to the fact the Allies wanted his head, Göring now decided actively to seek them out rather than wait for them to find him. He sent his adjutant, Colonel Bert von Brauchitsch, as an envoy to make contact with the Americans. He was armed with a letter addressed to Allied Supreme Commander General Eisenhower. In it, he offered his full cooperation in the rebuilding and running of Germany. The letter was delivered to the 36th Infantry Division at Kufstein. The division had already tracked down some high-profile Nazis, including senior German General Gerd von Rundstedt. Now, with the promise of another major Nazi, the division swung into action. Soldiers were ordered to prepare for a special mission. They readied their vehicles, weapons, and 5 days' worth of ammunition and rations. The first great Nazi hunt of the post-war era was underway. Rumors spread among the troops. Their target could be the biggest prize in Nazi Germany, second only to Hitler. The American column crossed the German lines. They passed through the eerily quiet fields of troops and motored on to Mautendorf, 54 miles away. But when they got there, Göring had gone. It seemed they had missed their prey. In fact, Göring had grown impatient at the lack of response to his letter and had set out to find the American Nazi hunters himself. Finally, contact was made on a road just outside Mautendorf. He was at the head of a long caravan of over 13 vehicles packed with his family, possessions, and entourage. To the surprise of everyone present, the Reichsmarshal seemed happy to see them. But this was not going to be the happy ending Göring had anticipated. On May the 16th, he was paraded before the world's press. Far from being included in plans for a post-war Germany, he had become the star exhibit, the prize captive. But even his star treatment was short-lived. General Eisenhower immediately called a halt to the media spectacle. From now on, Göring would be treated as a common criminal. He was flown to the US Army Interrogation Center at Augsburg, stripped of his medals and jewels, and placed in a cold, damp cell. There, the penny finally dropped for Hermann Göring. Now a series of interrogations began. They focused on all aspects of his role in the Nazi elite and his part in Hitler's grand plans. His art collections were of particular interest to the Allied interrogators. They were eager to see the treasures returned to their rightful owners. Goring guided US troops to their whereabouts. On May the 21st, the Star exhibit was told to dispense with his aids and prepare himself for a journey to stand trial for his crimes.
Behind the cold, gray facade of this courthouse in Nuremberg, the greatest trial drama of our times begins. Here, the governments of France, Russia, Great Britain, and the United States, representing civilization, oppose the top 20 leaders of an aggressor nation. The big Nazis are being charged with mass crimes against humanity.
November 1945. The attention of the world's press was focused squarely on Nuremberg. An international military tribunal was ready to charge the Nazi elite. Justice and democracy would be showcased against the despotic values of Nazism. The trial would be conducted in 5 languages using simultaneous translators. 2 judges from each of the Allied nations would preside. Hermann Göring led the defendants into the courtroom on November the 21st, 1945. Prison appeared to have been good for him. He looked sharper, more alert. He had lost weight. And he had weaned himself off his addiction to morphine. He immediately held court over the others. The most powerful of the Nazi elite left alive seemed to retain all his past status. All the defendants had been given copies of the indictment beforehand. They knew the charges against them. The tribunal had decided that the Nazi accused would be charged on 4 separate counts. Conspiracy to wage war, crimes against the peace for invading countries without provocation, war crimes for maltreating and executing soldiers and civilians, and crimes against humanity for the Holocaust.
Attention! Tribunal!
Lord Justice Lawrence and Sir Norman Burkitt, Britain, sit with 6 other judges, 2 each from US, France, and Russia. In a comprehensive indictment of 24,000 words are listed the charges against the prisoners, a record of iniquity without parallel.
The indictment was read out to the accused by lead US prosecutor Robert Jackson.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
But right from the start, Göring was up for a fight.
The prisoners were brought one by one to the microphone to plead. Number 1, Göring. How we all wish it had been Hitler himself.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Göring's confident plea of not guilty was a sign that he intended to take on his accusers. The prosecution began its case by trying to shock the court. They showed horrific film of the concentration camps. An American psychologist noted how Göring looked away, not watching the harrowing footage.
Intended to overthrow, and later did overthrow, the Weimar
As the trial continued, moving testimony from camp survivors was heard by the defendants.
Les récalcitrants ont été déportés, généralement, si j'ai bonne mémoire, à Sachsenhausen.
Grisly exhibits were shown to the court, including number USA 254, a shrunken human head used as a paperweight. The trouble was, it was easy to show how evil the regime had been. Even those in the dock couldn't defend what they had seen.
He held the formal rank of Oberbefehlsführer.
However, finding evidence that proved the individual accused were responsible was more complex. The task of pinning the blame on Göring began on March the 13th, 1946. As the embodiment of the Nazi regime, it became all the more essential to prove Hermann Göring's guilt and convict him.
At Nuremberg, the judges enter to hear the case for the defense in the war crimes trial. On the witness stand is Hermann Göring, leading living exponent of the Nazi philosophy and outstanding defendant among the score on trial. It is Göring's turn to testify and to answer the questions of Justice Robert Jackson, United States prosecutor.
Jackson had been appointed U.S. Attorney General in 1940. He had worked tirelessly to create the rules of the trial and devise the categories of charges. A lot hinged on his performance.
That you should suppress all individuals.
But Jackson, for all his expertise as a lawyer, lacked experience at cross-examination.
I asked to have you shown.
Kenn ich genau.
I asked to have you shown document 710, United States 509.
Göring had decided to defend himself. He immediately appeared unrepentant.
It was on the 22nd of April, 1938, when you published penalties for veiling the character of a Jewish enterprise within the Reich. Was it not?
Jawohl.
He then set about answering Jackson's questions, often speaking at length.
Das Kabinett Papen trat zurück. Bis dahin hatten nun alle Parteien Kabinette gestellt, wenn ich von den paar kleinen Splitterparteien absehe. Alle Männer, die irgendwie zur Verfügung waren, waren schon mal dem Volk präsentiert.
He spoke without notes, his detailed recollection of events underlining his total command of the situation.
Es war deshalb jetzt nur zwei Möglichkeiten. Entweder
It started to become obvious that Jackson was not up to the job.
und der Führer der stärksten Partei, wie das Parteien, wie das ja sonst
It seemed the Allies and Jackson in particular had underestimated the man who sat before them. Before the trial, Göring had trounced his co-defendants in the US Army IQ test. Now he showed he had regained much of his mental agility and incisive thinking. The great Nazi show trial was starting to unravel. One English lawyer even described how Göring impressed him. Suave, shrewd. He quickly saw the elements of the situation. His self-control, too, was remarkable.
möchte.
And yet, because of the...
Jackson managed to lay some blows about Göring's persecution of the Jews before 1939, as well as his hoard of plundered art treasures.
Of any kind to bear to prevent that step.
But none of this was enough to tie him to a major crime committed during the war.
Wohl überhaupt nur ich übernehmen und tragen konnte.
Göring repeatedly wormed his way out of the questioning.
Von der Verschiedenartigkeit des
Soon he started to gain the upper hand. He spoke English and understood Jackson's questions well before they were translated. This gave him plenty of time to plan his answer. Göring was getting away with it.
International law doctrine of reprisal.
Luckily, a man was standing by, ready to step into the breach. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe was the chief British prosecutor and a seasoned courtroom lawyer, well used to cross-examination. He immediately set about demolishing Göring's defense and pinning him to specific crimes against the Jews.
If the Jews there did not want to work, they were shot. If they could not work, they had to succumb. They are just pure parasites.
Next, he pinned a war crime on Göring, the shooting of British prisoners of war who escaped from a Luftwaffe camp in 1943.
Would you look at document D569?
Göring was rattled.
Would you look first at the top left-hand corner?
Finally, he placed Göring at the heart of the Führer's wars of aggression.
Published by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht.
Soon the Russians waded in, with precise questioning on Göring's role in the invasion of the Soviet Union. By March the 22nd, the cross-examination was over. In July 1946, 4 months after Göring first took the stand, all the defendants had spoken, and the defense counsels had given their final speeches. By then, Göring's only defense was that he had simply been motivated by love of his country. He denied ever having ordered the death of any single individual or any single atrocity. The world would have to wait until October the 1st, 1946 to find out what fate would befall the Star exhibit, as the judges considered their verdicts.
At Nuremberg, typical of the nationwide ruin Hitler brought upon Germany, justice was done to the men who sent millions of innocent citizens to death and torture. The voice of Lord Justice Lawrence pronounced the verdict of mankind.
Defendant Hermann Göring. The International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
Judgment had been handed down. Göring reacted calmly and left without saying a word. But as he was led away to the cells, he had already planned his final act of defiance, and it would surprise everyone. The day after his sentence, Göring wrote to the military tribunal. He demanded he face a firing squad, like a proper soldier. He argued he should not be hanged like a common criminal. But his request was refused. As the days passed before the execution, Göring saw his wife, Emmy, and daughter, Edda, and began to make his final preparations at the Nuremberg jail. The Allies made sure that none of the convicted Nazis could cheat the gallows. Anything that could be used to commit suicide was removed. The prisoners were kept under constant surveillance. Contact with the outside world was strictly controlled. Their guards never left their side, and the Nazis were forbidden to talk amongst themselves. Hermann Göring was just too precious to lose. On October the 7th, 1946, he received a visit from his wife, Emmy, for the last time. In the courthouse gymnasium, the gallows had been prepared and Göring's executioner selected. Master Sergeant John C. Woods would be the hangman. The execution was planned for 2 a.m. on October the 16th, 1946. It was supposed to be kept top secret, but Göring found out the day before. That evening, the prison chaplain visited Göring in cell 5. The German dispensed with any idea of religious forgiveness and declared he felt at ease. The gallows were then just 4.5 hours away. Göring received one last visit from his doctor. At 22:44, Göring's duty guard saw him convulse and exhale. He was dead. He had committed suicide by cyanide capsule. He had cheated the gallows in a final act of defiance. Now the question was, how had Göring smuggled in the capsule? Rumors circulated that Göring's suicide had been abetted by an accomplice. Candidates included his wife, Emmy, who was said to have slipped Göring the suicide pill during their farewell kiss. The official story is far simpler, and Göring ensured no one was blamed for the capsule. In a letter left in his cell addressed to the prison commandant, he boasted that he had 2 capsules hidden in his belongings at all times. The one he used was hidden in a pot of cream he had kept to treat his eczema. So it was that Nazi Germany's last senior figure escaped execution. To some of the victims of the Holocaust, it seemed unjust that the senior-most Nazis would never be formally punished for what they had done. But for others, the regime was at least made to face up to what it had done thanks to Nuremberg. Göring may have escaped the noose, but he was the most senior Nazi Party figure to stand trial. And in the end, he had seen his dreams of a place in post-war Germany shattered. Stripped of all the shiny accessories and opulence of his past life, he was made to face his crimes in black and white, like a common criminal. For such a vain man, this process must have hurt. And that fact will at least be some compensation for those who felt he never accepted the magnitude of his crimes.